Buenos días, muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos. Soy Julia Palacios, académica del Departamento de Comunicación de la Universidad Iberoamericana, y nos da mucho gusto tenerles aquí en estas celebraciones, esta conferencia, nuestra cuarta sesión en la celebración de los 25 años de la Cátedra UNESCO en Comunicación y Sociedad, que precisamente está sentada en el Departamento de Comunicación de la Ibero. Welcome, everyone. I'm Julia Palacios. I'm a staff member, an academic at the Communications Department at Universidad Iberoamericana, and it's my pleasure to receive you here in our fourth conference in these very, very successful sessions that we've had already, celebrating our 25th anniversary of the UNESCO Chair in Communication and Society, which is exactly chaired at the Communications Department at Universidad Iberoamericana. And it's my pleasure in this last session of this first part of our celebrations to introduce the chair of our Department of Communications, Professor Dr. Manuel Alejandro Guerrero, and he will introduce our guest speaker today. And I believe we will have an excellent, excellent session as we have had already. Thank you very much, Dr. Guerrero, please.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias, Julia. Buenos días a todas, buenos días a todos. So we are going to switch into English because the conference is going to be in English as well. So I have the honor here to present an excellent academic and a personal friend that I really appreciate a lot, Professor Paul Michalidis, who is a professor in the Department of Journalism and Assistant Dean in the School of Communication at Emerson College in Boston. He is a professor of news literacy, civic media, community activism. He's founder of the Master of Arts in Media Design and the founder of the Social Justice and Media Symposium. He's also a senior fellow of the Emerson Engagement Lab and faculty chair and director of the very prestigious Salzburg Academy on Media and Global Change. He has regular contributions to important journals like the New York Times, the Washington Post, Slate Magazine, the Nieman Foundation, USA Today, and a lot of other media. He has been lecturing on media literacy, news literacy, and he's actually one of the leading scholars in this area in the world. So I have the pleasure to introduce him here. And Paul, the mics are yours, friend.
Thank you, Manuel. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Palacios and Dr. Guerrero for inviting me and to congratulate Iberoamericana on 25 years of this UNESCO chair. It's a very prestigious honor. I know these chairs are a global network of researchers, and they've had such impact on field of communication and media. And I'm really honored to be able to speak with you today and honored to do it in the guise of the UNESCO chair. So Manuel, thank you again for that overly kind introduction. And I will begin to share my screen here in one second. Here we go. Okay, and then I will come into the presenter format. Okay, Manuel, is that okay for you? Everything okay? Seeing here. Okay, so once again, I'm really excited to be able to spend the next 30 or 40 minutes speaking to you about a recent book that I've published, and also to bring in some new research and ideas for this group around the title you see on the screen, Civic Media Literacies Pursuing Equitable and Just Civic Futures in a Time of Rampant Media Cynicism. Before I start my talk, I would just like to preface that the context of the research I'm sharing for you is in the United States frame. Some of the data and the examples and the information will be from this perspective, but I do hope that it honors and you can find connections with what's happening in your communities and nationally in the Mexican context as well. I hope this is relevant. I know you've just gone through some midterm elections, and we might be able to see some parallels in media systems and civic systems that speak to both the context that I will present today and the realities of what you see in the Mexican context as well. So I'll start the talk and look forward to having wonderful conversations if we can after. So just quickly to mention where this comes from, this text is available for download online for free and for purchase, where many of the ideas that I'll be speaking of today live in larger contexts. This is a recent book of mine that came out, and there's some new research we're doing which I'd like to expand on further. I want to start by just giving some context for how I understand approaching rampant media cynicism to preface my talk. And this idea came as in the United States, we see much of our media infrastructures and ecosystem. Trust in media has been falling here in the United States. Our social networks and our technological platforms, as much as they help us to advocate for causes and build peer groups of support, they've also been perhaps even more prioritized in terms of divisiveness, in terms of violent and reductionist rhetoric, in terms of spreading hate speech. And as you go further into deep internet subcultures, we have even more cynical outputs that we've lost the kind of context of media and its purpose to serve publics. And in the United States too, in this decentralized system we have, many of our mainstream media outlets in TV spaces, in newspapers have had to become slightly more sensationalized to keep viewership controls. And so when I say approaching rampant media cynicism, I want to explain what I mean by that today, and what the factors that I think are at play as media cynicism comes more forward in our societies and our communities today, and why I think civic media literacies need to respond to this with intentionality and with force. So, and the last thing I'll say here is we look at media and news literacies as a way to help prepare people to use media to engage meaningfully in their societies. But if we look at them simply as a solution or response to the increasing cynicism or the increasing divisiveness we see in our media systems today, then I think we run the risk of teaching people to accept the norms of what's happening in our technological infrastructures and our mainstream media infrastructures. And so I also want to question that as well. So I'll begin my talk with this and move forward. One quote that had captured me at the start of this research was by Michael Bugeja, who's written a wonderful book called Interpersonal Divide and the Age of the Machine, something I'd recommend for most people to read. And he wrote that in the age of ubiquitous media, we struggle with the rigors of the human condition. And in this, I find so much of meaning in thinking about media infrastructures and media cynicism. We struggle with the rigors of the human condition. And what Professor Bugeja was speaking about was that media used to be, or media has long been a place for us to convene, a way for us to understand the world around us and to understand our place and our sense of agency and belonging. Many of those, the rigors of the human condition, of us needing to be present with one another, of us needing to understand others, to understand values and identities and ideologies and systems, that media were a shared language space, but that the human condition is still what allowed us to connect and to participate meaningfully with each other. And his argument, and one that I want to build on, was that as media and mediated infrastructures have become more ubiquitous in our daily lives, we struggle with that rigor of engagement and of the effort that it takes to understand and to be present with others and to think beyond the own constraints of our lived experiences. we don't have as many opportunities to do that as our media infrastructures become, as our daily lives become more mediated and less in the presence of others in that human condition. So I have identified in my own research two norms that lead to this. And I want to go through these before I talk about the implications of them, and then what we can do in this space. And the first one that we've identified that you'd find in the book is this notion of spectacle. The second is distrust. And so here, I think most of you are familiar with these infrastructures. This is not the most complex slide I've ever put forward, but it's one that I like to share because it reinforces us in asking across these platforms what they represent in our civic infrastructure and what they represent in our democratic infrastructure. And so I want to start here by asking a few things. This is under the idea of spectacle, right? That spectacle is a term that Guy Debord brought to the mass media representation in the 1960s when saying that media can create spectacle when it creates representations, right? That then become part of the public narrative. And they have the ability to frame and lift these or to drop them. And I would say that our platforms and infrastructures that we see here, they have normalized spectacle in the lives of all the people that use these, right? And this could be across cultures and across borders and across divides. And of course, access is still an issue, but we know now. So as these technologies grew, and it's over the last 10 or 15 years, we knew the nascent potential of these technologies, and we know the values that are still perhaps inherent in them to bring people together and to advocate for causes. We also now know with strong and radical clarity that the values of these tools are to extract human data and to prioritize human time. And to do that, they've tapped into the notion of what humans grab onto, and that's foremost the spectacle, and they've found a way to kind of prioritize profit through spectacle. So if you look at tools like Facebook or YouTube, we now know enough research that integrating in our personal pleasures with civic and news articles to stoke those innate human abilities to want to see and understand fear and anger and things that we actually advocate for or things that we advocate against prioritized. We've seen research with YouTube that if you start to watch political videos, your recommendations take you further and further into spectacular and perhaps extremist views and values. We know that with Facebook, the algorithms are manipulated to prioritize the support of peer groups around content that's more popular and more shared, that's oftentimes more sensational or more extreme. We see this across our other platforms as well. The use of Twitter by politicians. I think a few things we should consider here in terms of spectacle is that, number one, the mainstream media is now opting into these spaces. And so the more that our mainstream media opts into these spaces, they opt into the values of these platforms. And so the values are to become more sensational, to have content that keeps distracted viewership engaged, so to quickly move from one idea and one platform to the next at the expense of true engagement and depth. And we know that bringing peers together in like-minded homophilous spaces where they're with each other is a much stronger way to share information than when you're presented with information from sources that are far behind you. So what we have is a spectacular infrastructure. Spectacle is normalized. The rigors of the human condition are exchanged for our time to be continually with these. And what that has done is it has, for one example, in the United States, as we navigate the space of COVID, it's allowed the narratives against science and against reason that we have so long, the idea of the expert and our scientific community is that it's allowed us to question that, but not even just to question that. The rigorous questioning has turned into, flat out denial the ability to use these networks to spread and to contain this denial, and to kind of put in doubt facts over and over again, right? And so this is done through the use of these platforms, and also, you know, smart information consumption to do so. And if you look at this, First Draft did some research a year ago, I think now, looking at the amount of posts and the examples of some of these kind of false rumors and their ability to be spread and shared in platforms that are ubiquitous. So if you look at political and economic motives, vaccine discourse on social media, right? That governments are using vaccines for political motives. How many impressions out of 1,200 posts, and the type of examples, safety, efficacy, and necessity. Are vaccines safe? Are they effective? Conspiracy theories, liberty and freedom. Are vaccines to affect civil liberties and personal freedom? If you look at the imprints of these, the use of memes, the use of videos that are engaging and that are spreadable and that live in those internet subcultures, it actually provides us with a norm of spectacle, and it's rampant and it's vast. And so, again, I don't know if this is an indictment on the platforms themselves. It's clear that in my estimation, this is more of a total information and infrastructure, and one that has large capitalist tendencies as well, right? Simply to continue to engage viewers and be more spectacular in that sense. And just to bring up a Pepe the Frog again, there's recently a documentary that's called Feels Good Man, and it's a very strong, it's a strong articulation of the story of Pepe the Frog. And for those of you who don't know, and I don't know how many people don't know at this point, but you know, a frog born as an internet comic subculture by an artist who has been co-opted for political gain, has been used around the world to signal, to signal by extremist groups on the right and by protest groups advocating for social causes on the left, but is a wonderful example of the way that popular culture and characters and figures that become embedded in our civic imagination can be used to kind of supersede and to sub-navigate mainstream media and credible information in very spectacular and effective ways. And so I write here the principle of layers. People care more about information that confirms values than that which is accurate. There's some really strong research that came out of Penn State some years ago talking about the idea of, like, when we think about source and credibility and spectacle in our information, that with the invent of platforms and social media, is that we are so removed from the sources. And oftentimes media literacy advocates will say we need to teach about source and credibility. And I agree with them. But in the principle of layers, it says you're receiving information that has been published somewhere, republished, shared by a friend, and then posted to this space. And so oftentimes you must continue to go down. And when it's in platforms that actually prioritize you to not look forward, that are always giving you new small hits of information, that oftentimes sourcing credibility is almost it's cognitively difficult for us to do. So in the case of Pepe, what we saw here in the United States in our elections was that a kind of a stoner frog that was looked at as a counterculture icon for youth became, because he was so embedded in young people in the internet subcultures, he became co-opted by those groups and used to advocate across internet subcultures. So you'll see here that he started to be used for a number of negative propaganda and a number of hate and violent groups. And then he was brought into mainstream political norms. And so these are all actual images that were used by our former president on his social network feeds, sent out to supporters, understanding the cultural power of this in the internet subculture and using the norms of spectacle, right? This idea of strong imagery and power and connected across different violence and hate groups to use a popular cultural icon to spread and share image, right? So this becomes, I think, for me, the norm of spectacle, right? When spectacle has become so normal in our society, we must ask ourselves what ways can we find and enact the rigors of the human condition that are necessary for our civic communities to coexist and to be together, right? And so the last slide here on spectacle comes from the United States perspective. And it's almost like our cynicism of media around spectacle is now simply acknowledged and accepted more, even by, in surveys of US adults who are now recognizing and acknowledging in this context how much we have lost trust, or how cynical we've become. So if you look at this chart on the left, what people think drives news judgment, how many people will pay attention to their story is often the first. How many people are affected is there, and then it goes down. A desire to help problems in society, the personal biases or political viewpoints of the journalist are on the lower end, but it's really about what people want to listen to. And if you look at that in the context of our civic and our digital technology norms, it becomes even more challenging to think about rigor and nuance. And then on the right, Americans are most often more negative than positive about news media's role in society. If you look at their charts, care about doing a good job, more adults say news organizations do, but then after that, the percentages dip to care about people they report on. US adults think that news organizations are actually divided. They don't care much. They're too critical. They hurt democracy more than they protect democracy, right? This type of standards are very alarming for us. And I think part of this is, there's another stat that that recently came out about how many people actually interface with journalists or media organizations, and it's at the lowest it's ever been since in 30 or 40 years since they started tracking this information. Once again, because the norms of these mediated platforms take us away from those human connections that were supposed to be reliable for our media and information and democratic systems. I say this now in the context of distrust, not to be, I want to set up this problem because I think it's, we say in our design research that if you don't understand the problem correctly, it becomes much harder to figure out types of responses. And so I want to put these ideas out there because I think understanding these norms is the most helpful thing we can do to thinking about how we can respond to them. The second, I think the second main kind of idea that we've introduced to this culture of media cynicism is that of distrust. And distrust is not something new. This is a chart that's now from 2017 that just shows that percentage of trust, an Edelman study that shows that percentage of trust in our public institutions has been decreasing for some time. And across all public institutions or sectors, it's decreasing. But with media, it's decreasing more than any other public sector. And I think there's a couple reasons why I want to bring up in the distrust factor. The first is, I think we can connect here the emergence of what we've called the news desert with distrust. So this is a University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill did some research on the gutting of the local news infrastructure in the United States. And here you see, this has actually become much worse since this study was done about a year or two ago. But the amount of districts or regions in the United States that have gone down to 1 or 0 newspapers, and the follow-up study is that the quality of these newspapers has gone in such decline. And so the emergence of spaces that have little to no local news, and local news is often a strong predictor of civic health in communities. And when that goes away, then people start turning towards their internet platforms. So I think this is one of the biggest reasons why we're seeing less trust in media. If you turn to the mainstream national news networks, you see really spectacular and sensationalist and very siloed and polarized information. If you turn to the mainstream press, you see information that's quite often removed. And then the local news has become so gutted that it's very hard to even understand or locate what's happening in your own communities, right? So this is a problem. And just for a reference point, I picked another map of news deserts emerging in Brazil as just a kind of a comparison point so that we can see that this phenomenon seems to be global and it seems to be based largely in technological. Now, one other thing I want to bring up, a study coming out of the Tao Center in Columbia University recently, which I find fascinating, is that not only have news deserts emerged, but what has been replacing news deserts is something that's very, I think, very interesting for us to consider. And that is that in the space of news deserts, hundreds of hyper-partisan sites are masquerading as local news. So I've looked into a few of these. And so what has come in as a very strong target in spaces where there's one or no local newspapers is, organizations or groups that have, strong political motivations or strong motivations for some end, have been very savvy at building hyper-partisan local news sites and masking them as a new local news initiative in Pennsylvania, for example. And they start to put in stories, and they do a wonderful job. Like, it's almost like the advertising strategy of mixing in local and progressive ideas with, everything else. So they'll build in local news stories that seem to be neutral or interesting human interest stories, and then they'll connect those and combine those with stories that are focusing largely on political issues that are divisive and violent and reductionist, right? So this is a fascinating phenomenon that's further eroding and embedding into our local news spaces. I also want to say, I think that these mainstream newspapers that we have relied on, the New York Times, for example, the Wall Street Journal, these kind of large media giants now that are no longer newspapers, but large media companies themselves, I think they are some of the biggest culprits in the emergence of news deserts, because their strategies has been to, enter into local markets, which with force, right? And I know that these large media companies, their aim is to become the local news source for those. So that's what the New York Times wants to do. But what they're doing is they're replacing the local news sites without putting people on the ground and just trying to divert regional stories into those spaces. And I think they've been as guilty as political spaces in actually causing news deserts to emerge, right? As the technological platforms are. We know that this, again, if we look at spectacle and we bring it to distrust, we know that a study of MIT in 2019 looked at tens of millions of Twitter sites and fake news versus the spreading of credible news. And by every metric, they said that stories that are emotionally resonant, that are false, but emotionally resonant, that appeal to values and beliefs, are shared with far more regularity than those that are complex or that are removed or of truth. So I think we know this now, and we see it happening as well. But this also leads us to question trust and to build trust. And one last point before I move on, and excuse the language here, but I wanted to bring up what's underlying this kind of the distrust and spectacle. And when we say fake news, I think we often think about manipulative lying for personal intents. And I do believe that that's happening. And in our political norms, I think our political leaders and elites are very good at manipulating these tools, right, for their own gain. And we see a lot of struggle between regulation and between the free market principles of these technologies and platforms. But I think what we need to do is differentiate in terms of like our understanding these media spectacles. Is the liar versus what Henry G. Frankfurt in the 80s wrote this wonderful treatise, very short book, and it's worth the read, which he called On Bullshit. And he wrote here, bullshit is speech intended to persuade without regard for truth. The liar cares about the truth and attempts to hide it. The bullshitter doesn't care if what they say is true or false, but rather only cares whether the listener is persuaded. And I think it's a fascinating fact to say that, like, in our current political and civic and news infrastructures in these platforms, we tend to see the appropriation of bullshit and the all-out lie, meaning that we know this thing is happening and we need a strategy to hide it. That's a lie. And I think differentiating that is really important, because what we see a lot is bullshit, is no regard for the truth, but simply regard for aligning the listener with their own ideological or their own motivations, right? And that to me is a fascinating differentiator. It allows us to create different context for when we go into these spaces and see the proliferation of information. So I did want to put that forward. So, and now coming to the part of the speech, the last portion of the speech, and I want to just show a short video here. What I think one of the biggest things that has emerged in this idea of rampant media cynicism, and why I think when I turn to the civic media literacies, this type of responses, these two phenomena of spectacle and distrust support what we call emerging agency gaps between articulating concern and the capacity to act. So I'm involved in quite a large new research project now on looking at equity in media literacy practices, looking at impact and equity. And we find we're doing a lot of work on care, on how people care about things and how people care for things. And the way that people get motivated to actually use and think about media in terms of supporting equity in their communities and their society. And what we've noticed, what this research shows us, is that when you normalize spectacle and when the distrust of media becomes so embedded in the way that we think and talk about issues and events in our world today, we see social media being a place where people can voice their concern about these things and voice their hate or voice their opinion quite loudly, signaling. That's called caring about. But the capacity to care for, to actually, the rigors of the human condition that propel us to go out into the world and to care and to be with others and to support, that a lot of our cognitive space is taken up by the spectacle and distrust, and not a lot is left to act. So I want to, this is a video from 2014, and it actually maps, I'm going to show this as a segue into what I think are potential responses to this norm. So this video, which I still find so relevant for our conversations today, one graduate student here in the United States as a project took GDELT data, so it's a kind of a global resource of a global database of information that has a host of different types and sectors involved. So he took that database and he mapped on, so I'm going to start playing this. It starts in 1979 and it ends in 2013. Every instance of news coverage of a civic event or a protest or a social movement or so on and so forth. So let me try to get this. There we go. And there's no sound here and I want to play it. So see, I hope you can all see that clearly. Every instance of protest that was covered or reported that's in this database was mapped. And if you see on the bottom here, you see now we're in the mid 80s and it's actually fascinating. You can see there are certain parts of the world like Europe and in the end of the 80s, the Middle East has quite often had a presence in terms of social or civic unrest or protest map, part of the United States. And this is not simply just large scale protests, it's any type of coverage of groups that are advocating or protest for something. So I want us to look very closely at the implications of technology now. As we get into the mid 90s and the late 90s, you see we have slightly uptick in coverage. So media has become more ubiquitous. I would say now when you get into the late 90s, you have home computers and now the World Wide Web and the internet are with us. And then you get in the early 2000s is when Google comes aboard and home computing is proliferant in most of these places in the world. 2003, 2004, you have laptops, and 2004, 2005 is when you start to see social networks happening. So 2006 is when YouTube comes. 2007 is smartphones and iPhones. 2008 is the birth of the smartphone, and Twitter and Instagram are here. And then you really see this ubiquitous information technology. So if you look at 2011, 2012, now look what's happening in our world when we have these technologies so embedded. And thank you for watching. Yep, I wanted to come back to one of these. Oops, sorry. I want to come back to the last screen here when you see our world from this perspective that has become so, you could argue two things. You could argue that our world has become more violent and full of protest. You could argue that it's all collapsing, or you could argue that with these technologies and the ability to articulate concern over and over again, that we have come to a point where we are in a state of spectacle and in a state of distrust and in a state of unrest. And we have come into kind of contrast with the human rigors of being present with and caring for each other and finding ways to connect and push society forward. You could argue that everyone with a connection and a phone in their hand now, where access is prevalent, has opted into these norms, and that has created a problem. And so one last thing, just quickly here, before I conclude with what I think the responses are. Wael Ghonim, who was, an early part of the MENA uprisings and the Arab Spring, he had a talk a few years ago, which he outlined in a subsequent book, which he outlined, there are some reasons why this is problematic, and we don't know how to deal with rumors. They spread too fast. We tend to only communicate with people we agree with. Online discussions are not spaces for robust and complexity. They quickly descend into reductionist rhetoric. We're forced to jump to conclusions, and our digital values and norms favor broadcasting over engagement, posts over discussions, and shallow commitment over deep interaction. So I put those up there to, I think we know this now. I don't think any of this is shocking to us. And I think we need to be critical, because I think a lot of times those of us in the media literacy community, we've always wanted to navigate the opportunities that our current digital realities and ecosystems give us, along with the constraints. I think that model makes sense. But what I've seen over the last 10 years in my own research and in working with colleagues like Manuel and Ibero and his research is that as these platforms have become more commodified and invasive and extractive, I think we need to be more critical in terms of not weighing what they're giving versus taking away, but actually looking at their impact on civic and democratic spaces. And my personal opinion on this is those platforms have always been great in helping people advocate around local causes. So, neighborhood sharing initiatives, environmental cleanup, advocating for school lunch and health, and those are wonderful. The minute they have become part of our larger civic processes that are complex and demand people's time and attention, they've become much more problematic. And so when I ask what is to be done, I think in our work, what we're working on now is looking at using media literacies not simply to help prepare people to navigate or respond to these norms. I think that's important, but actually being very intentional about bringing media literacies, or how we prepare citizens for lives of meaningful engagement that are completely mediated, about making that a civic imperative and not simply a way for us to better understand and have skills to deconstruct and critique media. Do that, but also if we think about media literacy as the civic imperative for the future of healthy civic societies, we then reorient it from simply the skills needed to the types of presence we need in our civic lives through and with media. And that, I think for me, that shift is important. And so I will lay out what this means for us and why in the last few minutes I have before we can switch to hopefully some questions and answers. I just say that why this matters, because media literacy practices that just ask us to give people more skills on how to use these tools and how to think about credibility and sourcing, they matter, but they'll never match the pace of technological information. They often prioritize us being individuals in silos and not us being connected to others. And they exacerbate social and civic inequities because they prioritize those institutions and people and structures that have more resources, and they continue to leave the under-resourced and the marginalized further behind. So what does civic intentionality mean in media literacy? I think it means shifting a priority on skills and competencies alone to prioritizing values that support meaningful engagement in civic life with and through media. We think about process before technology, people before products, and values before skills. And what does that look like as us, is that media literacies in this sense become not simply mechanisms for how do we access media or analyze or critique. If we want to start to think about reforming these norms of spectacle and distrust, we need to think about caring, right? How do we care for things? How do we signal and affiliate caring about? How do we take that into care for? And what role can media help us play in actually using the resources and time to care? Consciousness. How do we understand our own standpoint? We talk a lot about where do I stand and how do I affiliate where my standpoint and my consciousness map onto these issues in the world. Imagination, we cannot understand aspirational futures without imagining what they look like, right? So what values of imagination? If we're constantly within the frame of those networks and those media systems that are constantly prioritizing spectacle and distrust, we lose the ability to imagine what alternative futures would look like, right? How do we persist against the norms of spectacle and distrust and the norms of the tools that ask us to continue to be ideologically available to those with us and against those without us? And last time, I see this as very important about the emancipatory potential of civic intentionality. If we don't approach our media literacy experiences or our civic media infrastructures as something within which we are taking those at the most marginalized places of society and helping them become part of our work and our ideas, then we would continue to exacerbate the inequities that exist in our civic and media infrastructures. Just to end here, I put, look at what are responses to distrust and spectacle. Well, I think as someone who studies news and media literacies and civic media, as someone who works in communities, thinking about how we can build media interventions that help respond to problems. This is what I'm doing for most of my applied and my practice career. I find that you can't teach communities and practitioners and organizations to use media simply to go into these networks and advocate. They must be driven by values of what communities do we need and how are we going to care for those communities? How can we use a civic imagination to think beyond our current constraints? What resources do we have and how can we use our standpoint? How do we persist with communities? These things I think matter in terms of any media intervention that will help respond to such problems. Lastly, I think if you put these values in between voice and participation, so voice being the first thing that we have in our path towards civic participation, agency is the willingness to enact our voice. I think we must ground these values in agency, and that our voices matter towards participation in society, but agency is that sense of efficacy that we have. And efficacy is born from our ability to imagine, our ability to care, our ability to persist, our ability to emancipate, and our ability to have critical consciousness towards this end. So I will end there. I would thank you and thank Manuel and Julia and Ibero again. And I know we have some time for a few questions, so I'll stop sharing my screen as well. And Manuel, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for this very enlightening talk. Well, I think that the concept of civic intentionality is really very, very interesting in our modern world. But I have a question because as teacher, as lecturer, I have usually found very challenging to try to communicate this new kind of values and these new kind of efforts for students to regard the world with other eyes, especially when younger audiences probably have not been acquainted to other forms of framing information as our generation, for example, and they have so been embedded into this spectacularization of information. Who could be the most important piece here to push forward this civic intentionality? Do you think the educational institutions, the family, the government, who has the first force in pushing forward this thing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really wonderful question, and it's, you know, it's something that we think about a lot, and it's you know, I can answer the question for the sake of my own opinion, but it's really hard to isolate, you know, because it's not, you know, if you look at government and regulators and the way that they're using and understanding these media infrastructures, it's very hard to, you know, to see civic intentionality working without having some intervention into the media norms. You know, I think, and the home and the families, right? Like there is such different points of entryway and access to how families and homes negotiate technologies. And there's a whole nother field on young people and their lived reality with technology. I think all of them are important. I think for the sake of my own work in answering your question in that context, I mean, you know, where I think we've seen the most, traction has been, you know, I would say between educational institutions, but not at the primary level, but maybe at the secondary education levels, and also in the communities, like in the community groups and the community advocacy groups that want to do this work, that need support at the very grassroots level. Like there's been a lot of strong interventions, at least here where I work in Boston and those surrounding communities, about using our higher education resources connected with the institutions, the community institutions that are trying to do this work. And I think there's a lot of potential there about bringing together our resources, because they have, community organizations normally have the pulse of issues on the ground. They're normally at a level of connection and engagement. They're not abstracted like you are in higher level forms of governments or even in most public governments, right? So they are able to bring communities together. They have access to problems and spaces, and oftentimes don't have the resources to do this work. And so I think starting on the very base community level is the most important. And educational institutions, you know, I would say that in the United States, it's very hard because they're very overtaxed and have very limited ability to do this. In higher education, there is more ability to do that. But I think the community is where you start, and then you scale up from there. Starting with trying to get into government issues is very challenging, especially in this regard.
Yeah. Well, I have another question, because at the time when the platforms have all the, you know, all this logic from taking from the algorithms to put people into these kind of bubbles and well, the echo chambers and all these things. And when politicians, even in democracies, I mean, they are profiting from polarizing discourses and making taking more gains from that sort of speech than from another sort of speech based on understanding and trust. How can the community-based work that I think that you emphasize based on values I think that are based on trust and understanding and regard for the other, how can we challenge this vision when the platforms and the platform's logic and the politicians' discourse, even in democracies, are acting in the opposite way?
Yeah, I mean that is. I mean, I think, Manuel, you've hit on the core. You've hit on that core question, and I guess that question is so important, and I guess the only way, like, so there's two ways I think we could approach this. Is, you know, if you can't ignore the political norms, and you can't ignore the platform norms, but, you know, and you can't be cynical about it, but the idea that those would reform based on like this, our democracies are so embedded with these platforms, and our politicians are so embedded with these platforms as a way to articulate and to bring, you know, to move populations in their favor. The only thing I've seen is, you know, if you can remove that level of, if you can start to work on issues at the number of one, the N of one in the local community. So for example, you know, and when we've done this research here, if you work with a group we work with an organization now that, that, for example, is an organization that works to put on local artist ventures for underserved or minority artists in Greater Boston. And, the minute that they opt into Facebook and the minute that they start, we need to make YouTube videos, they start to opt into like, what do we need to do to make this YouTube video better? And my thought is like, instead of thinking about how to advocate for your work, we start thinking about these values, right? Like, let's think about interventions with certain members in the community, and not just how many people do we reach, but who do we reach? How do we reach them? How can we impact them with these values? And then think about the role that media plays, and not think about the scale of this as like, we're gonna have to end up reforming everything. But it has to start at a very community level. And it has to start by the values is what bring the people together. And so that it's not that you ignore the larger narratives politically, in the larger narratives around these media companies that that are very capitalist in their orientation, but you have to circumvent them somehow. And circumventing them is to be with others together in these initiatives. And if there's enough traction and they scale up, then you think about the way that you can use, or that you can reform, or that you can push against. So I think that's a balance. I do.
Okay, so at the end, and this is more a personal question, you are optimistic about the possibility to rescue the digital spaces from actual polarization and hate. You think we can, or at least is something that's worth it?
I think I'm optimistic about rescuing the human experience around this, not the reforming. I think on a personal level, I think we all navigate our own use of these technologies. Like I always say, like, they have wonderful capacities to see what people are up to and to be connected to. We use them in our professional and personal circles, right? Even between Boston and Mexico City and Lebanon and where else. Like, I think those are again. I'm most optimistic about rebuilding the human experience and the civic experience, and causing there to reform these technological platforms. In terms of the platforms themselves, I think you and I both see this oscillation of innovation in these spaces. And I guess what I would like to think is that our efforts here are another disruption to the increasingly invasive norms of those platforms that will eventually cause them to have to move on to something else. But I do think we have a lot of potential and capacity now to reinvigorate, to bring the human condition back into our civic lives, and to use media to that end, and to use art to that end, and to use film to that end, and to continue to grow in that capacity versus, just to conclude my thought, is like in the media literacy space, is we're not just pushing to teach more people how to use media all the time in our schools. Like, to me, that is a very noble effort, and I would be happy to see that more happen. But I think it's an effort that will fail in its ability to catch up to the, then we'll always be trying to catch up to these platforms and their tools. And I would love to see our media literacy efforts focus on how we can allow young people to take initiative in their community with others for strong social causes, and then think about the media implications of that, right? Instead of simply teaching them how to respond to these media norms that, I don't think will take us to any more promising civic futures. So I can end there.
Thank you. I think that the key you just mentioned is that to rescue the human condition in all this equation. Thank you very much, Professor Paul Michalidis from Emerson College in Boston, for this very interesting talk for the 25th anniversary of the UNESCO Chair in Communication and Society in Mexico City. Thank you to all of our viewers. Paul, do you have any last remark?
Just that I appreciate the opportunity, and if anyone's interested in following up further, you can find my information in the contact. And thanks to Ibero and UNESCO and Manuel and Julia and your colleagues for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you very much. have a very nice day in the name of the Department of Communication and the UNESCO Chair in Communication and Society. Thank you very much to all our audience as well, to Dr. Julia Palacios, to Paola Gomez, and to Ana Alvarez. Thank you very much and have a very nice day. Thank you. We stop recording now.